Good evening. I'm very honored to be here tonight with you. Some time ago, I was asked to substitute the Israeli Minister of Intelligence briefing a group that was visiting Israel. So I went to the room, the group was sitting, and the organizer came to me, and she was like on the verge of a total meltdown. I was like, okay, what happened? And she goes like, the itinerary was changed. The group is supposed to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu in about half an hour, which leaves you, meaning me, 10 minutes to talk about the Middle East, including questions. So my response was like, what's the problem? It's a lunatic area, thank you very much and goodbye. Done with the presentation, done with the briefing. Tonight I have 20 minutes to talk about the Middle East, then to be followed with your questions, and it's a great honor for me to be here tonight. What I would like to try to do in the next 20 minutes is to provide you with a GPS to navigate your way in the dramatically changing Middle East in the second decade of the 21st century, understanding the major factors that shapes the Middle East, and how does it impact Israel's geostrategic environment. There are three major factors, forces, that are involved in the shaping of the Middle East today and in the foreseeable future. One is the challenges of the Arab societies. A very quick quiz. How much did you hear about this term called the Arab Spring? Yeah. The Arab Spring, some people call it, I call it the Arab Awakening. Many people in the Arab world call it the Arab Winter. The Arab Springs, I'm talking about the events that shaped the Arab world, the Arab societies in the last couple of years, known as the Arab Spring. To make a long story short, the Arab Awakening, the events that we saw in Egypt and in Libya and in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Jordan and other places, are basically the outcry of millions of people in the Arab societies who demand their governments and rulers with real answers to the real problems. Housing solutions, medical treatment, employment opportunities, running water, reliability, transparency, and so forth and so forth. In other words, the Arab Awakening is not about Israel. It's not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is about the challenges of the Arab societies per se. This is the first factor. The second factor is a massive conflict that is rocking and shaking the Middle East today, but it is not new. It's a historical one. And this is the conflict between two major axes, the Sunnis versus the Shiites. How many of you heard the term Shiites? Let me very briefly just explain. Majority of the Muslims in the world are Sunnis, 85%. 15% are Shiites. Shiite is a word in Arabic that means political faction. What we see today in 2015 in different parts of the Middle East is the open total collision between Sunnis and Shiites in different parts of the Middle East, when the conflict itself, the roots for that conflict goes back 1400 years ago. What's the story? Very shortly, in the 7th century, this is the century where Islam emerged, the fourth ruler, Caliph of the Muslim Empire, Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was assassinated. He had two sons and a daughter, and the youngest son, Al-Hussein, said, my father was the Caliph, therefore I should be next one in line. His political opponent says, with all the respect, sir, Islam is not about dynasty, it's about the most suitable person for the position. The political conflict turned into a violent conflict. In the year 680, we are talking 1400 years ago, in a place called Kerbela, it's Iraq of our times, Al-Hussein, the youngest son of Ali, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, his household, his sister, his followers were butchered in this place called Kerbela. This is the time Islam splits. Majority Sunnis, minority Shiites, and ever since they have been brutally slaughtering each other. They are both Muslims, yet the theological, cultural, political, historical gaps and animosities are non-bridgeable. Ever since the Shiites, which are the minority, has been motivated by the belief that they have been deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world. You cannot understand the history of the Middle East without understanding the magnitude of this conflict. And then there is another massive conflict that shapes the Middle East. It's between two big civilizations in the Middle East. One is the Arab civilizations. You see Saudi Arabia, the Arab Peninsula, and one of its bigger rivalry, the Persian civilization. Today you see it under the name of Iran. In course of time, what happened was that the two conflicts basically fused into two basic camps fighting over influence and power in the Middle East. Arab Sunni camp on the one hand, Persian Shiite on the other hand. In the year 1979, something very important happened in the Middle East, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And in Iran comes to rule the Mullah regime. Mullah is the description of the rank within the Shiite clergy. So when we are saying mullahs, for example, we are saying Ayatollah, Ruhallah. These are kind of like ranks within the Shiite clergy. They come to power in Iran, and ever since for the last generation, this conflict that has been going on all the time for centuries was escalating in the Middle East and intensifying in the Middle East. Why? Because the new regime in Iran, the Mullah regime, is motivated by the concept known as exporting the Iranian revolution, the Islamic revolution. They are interested in exporting the revolution in different parts of the Middle East for two major objectives. One is to position Iran as the leading superpower in the Middle East, and two, by doing that, in their mindset, they are undoing the injustice that was caused to the Shiites back in 680. What happened in course of time, and mostly in the last generation, the Iranian regime, unfortunately quite skillfully, was able to export the revolution, and he was doing that mostly by using a platform that is known by the name of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the last generation, the Iranian regime very skillfully positioned himself as the spearhead of the defenders of the Palestinians in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and taking advantage of a terminology, a code word that became very accepted in the Middle East, known in Arabic as al-mukawama, the resistance. The Iranian regime, under that slogan, was able to create strongholds in different parts of the Middle East. In Lebanon, where he nurtured and developed a local Lebanese organization called Hezbollah. I guess you heard this name. Hezbollah means the party of God. It's two words. This is one place. Another place is southwest of Israel in a place called the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is controlled by Palestinians affiliated organization called Hamas. The Palestinians are Sunnis. They are not Shiites. Nevertheless, what brings together Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip together with the Hezbollah in Lebanon is the fact that they are both sharing the concept of the resistance. The resistance is the code word in the Middle East today and in the last generation. It is the code word for the commitment to continue the fight against the state of Israel. No compromise, no concessions, no reconciliation, no agreement, no nothing. And the Iranian regime was very skillfully playing with that in order to gain popularity in different parts of the Middle East, and through that platform to create himself different strongholds. The most important stronghold that the Iranian regime has is in another Arab state. If you look at the map, it's not so far from Israel. It's called Syria. Syria is a 23 million people Arab state. Majority of the Syrians are Sunnis. As you probably know, Syria is going through a terrible war through the last couple of years. Some people still, for some reason, call this war a civil war. The war in Syria is not a civil war. The war in Syria is a Sunni Shiite war. It's a war by proxies between the Arab world and the Iranians. You may wonder why the Iranians are involved in the war in Syria. The answer, Syria, which is an Arab Sunni state, is controlled by a minority called Alawites. It's about 15 or less % of the Syrian people, about 2 million people. Assad, the current president of Syria, is one of the Alawites families, and they have been controlled Syria for the last 40 years or so. So you have an Arab Sunni state controlled by a Shiite distanced branch, the Alawites, and under Assad regime, Syria became a very important component in the structure that the Iranian regime was building in the region. In fact, Syria under Assad regime is the major pillar that holds this structure that was built by the Iranians. By the way, the Iranians poured billions and billions and billions of dollars building that structure. As much as they are concerned, this is a money that was very well spent. When the war started in Syria and Assad regime at some point was under the danger of going down, the Iranian regime rushed to save Assad by doing two things. The Iranian boosted their support, militarily, oil, money, and so forth and so forth. And other thing, they ordered their most important proxy, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, to send its elite forces to Syria to save Assad from falling down. That is the point where the war in Syria actually turned into a Sunni Shiite war, because as far as the Arab and the Muslim Sunni world is concerned, Syria is today under an Iranian Shiite invasion and occupation. The Arab are calling that al-Ghuzwa al-Safawiyya. Safawi is the name of the Persian in the old terminology of the Muslims, and Ghuzwa is a term in Arabic which means a raid, an invasion. So as far as the Arab world is concerned, today in 2015, Syria, one of the most important states of the Arab world, is under a Shiite Iranian invasion, but that's not the end of the story. Because only recently, Iranian senior people bragged, saying, we, Iran, we control today 4 Arab capitals: Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a in Yemen. So you have today 4 different stages in the Middle East. Lebanon is a smoking volcano. Syria is an erupting volcano. Iraq is an erupting volcano. Yemen is an erupting volcano. And one of the common denominators of these volcanoes is that each and every one of them somehow, to a certain extent, to a lesser extent, or to a bigger extent, is related to the Sunni Shiite total collision. This is the second factor that today, in 2015, shapes dramatically the landscape of the Middle East. As you probably know right now, there is an Arab military coalition under the leadership of Saudi Arabia that is operating in Yemen. They are fighting against local Yemenite factor that is called the Houthis. It's a Shiite tribes in Yemen, supported by the Iranian regime, and the Saudis leading this coalition in order to block the attempt of the Houthis to take over Yemen. In other words, basically they are trying to block Iran from taking control over Yemen, and mostly in the context of the most enormously important strategic Bab el-Mandab Strait along the Indian Ocean. So when you look today in the different parts of the Middle East, you see this conflict in different levels and intensity that is taking place. And in that context, something very important, obviously the Iranian nuclear military project. I'm sure that you are all familiar with this topic. Here is what I would like to add on that context. As far as the Arab world is concerned today, the Iranian regime is about to become a nuclear military superpower. The Arab world today openly is talking about arming itself with the same capacity. The Saudis are already negotiating with Pakistan. Pakistan is the only Muslim state, by the way, Sunni, that has a nuclear military armed capacities. Saudi Arabia signed contract with South Korea to establish new nuclear reactors, to do a nuclear program. Egypt is conducting negotiations with Russia to have a nuclear military facilities for peace purposes. Jordan, the same thing. You should be aware of the fact that today in 2015, as far as the Arab world is concerned, the common sentiment is that it seems like in the mindset of the Arab world that Iran is going to become a nuclear military superpower. In that case, the Arab world is saying very clearly, we are not going to sit quietly and watch that. We are going to arm ourselves as well. In other words, in 2015, today, I would say basically for the first time ever in the history of this region, the Middle East is on the verge of entering a nuclear military arm race. So this is the second factor. So reminding you again the factors. One, the challenges of the Arab societies, the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening, okay? Two, the Sunni Shiite / Arab Iranian conflict in different parts of the Middle East. And the last factor is what I call the struggle over identity, path, and direction of the Arab societies. When you look at the map and you see the states, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and so forth, none of them existed as an independent state before the 20th century. They all emerged in the 20th century as an independent states. Ever since, Arab societies have been engaged in an inner debate regarding the question, what is our identity? What is our path? Where do we want to go? And roughly speaking, you could identify three major camps that are involved in this struggle. One is what I will call political Islam. And I will take the most well-known representative of this camp, the biggest mass movement in the Muslim Sunni world, known as the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the biggest mass movement, Sunni movement, in the Muslim Sunni world, established in Egypt in the late 20s of the 20th century. Here is the vision of the Muslim Brotherhood. They say, we envision, in the end of the process, a world where you do not have an independent sub-political entities. You don't have Syria. You don't have Jordan. You don't have Lebanon. You don't have Iraq. You have alternatively caliphate. One frame where everybody lives their life according to the implementation of the Islamic religious law known by the name of Sharia, which is the equivalent, roughly speaking, of the Jewish halakha, if you wish to look at it this way. Yet, Muslim Brotherhood says, we understand this is a long process. We understand this is a process that has to run its course. Therefore, the Muslim Brotherhood says, we are willing for the time being to accept the presence or existence of an independent entities. This is a term known in Arabic by the name of tamkin, meaning making it possible, creating the conditions to the time in an undefined future where the conditions will be right to fulfill this vision. Ironically speaking, for example, Hamas, a Palestinian Islamist affiliated movement that controls the Gaza Strip, Hamas formally defined itself as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Ironically speaking, Hamas says, we want to have a Palestinian state. But basically, as part of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas says, in the end of the process, there should be no Palestinian state. There should be one big caliphate, ironically speaking. So this is the political Islam camp. The second camp, many people in the West will call it secular, liberal, democratic. I would not use this term. I would rather use the term civil society affiliated factors and modern national state supporters in the Arab societies. This camp, and there are many people that are part of this camp, everywhere, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and so forth, they have a different vision. They say, we don't want to see caliphate. We want to see an independent sub-political entities. Each and every one of these entities run its own life. It has its own parliamentary system. It has its own economy, army, society, and so forth and so forth. And they say, we envision those entities to be ruled not only according to the Islamic religious law, but also according to a civil society / modern independent national state values. So you see the difference between these two camps. And then there is a third camp, which is to a large extent the offspring of the political Islam, and this is radical Islam, militant radical Islam. It's an umbrella name. There are many groups and many names. You are probably familiar with one of them, for example. It's called ISIS, Islamic State in Syria and the Levant, or Syria and Iraq, ISIS, or as it's called in Arabic, Daesh, Al-Dawla al-Islamiyya fil Iraq al-Sham. Al-Qaeda, Jama'at Salafiyya, Jama'at Jihadiyya, and so forth and so forth. What's the common denominators of these groups? What is their ideology? They, similar to political Islam, envision the creation of a caliphate. But different from political Islam, they say, we do not want to wait until the time will come. We want to proactively make it happen. It's called in Arabic, takween. Make it happen now. Do it proactively. This is one difference. The other difference, unlike political Islam, radical Islam says, we envision that caliphate to be one that is implementing on the ground the most strict translation of the Islamic religious codex. The most severe one, the most radical one. There is something amazing when you look at this camp today, in 2015. In the last generation, this camp has been going through an inner radicalization process. ISIS is the offspring of Al-Qaeda. Are you familiar with the fact that about a year ago, Al-Qaeda detached himself from ISIS? One of the reasons Al-Qaeda formally detached himself from ISIS was that even Al-Qaeda leadership was disturbed with ISIS brutality. And we're talking Al-Qaeda, 9/11. This is very important because the inner radicalization process that radical Islam camp has been going mostly through the last generation has a practical manifestation on the ground. How and why? Militant Islam says it's not only that we want to proactively create this caliphate right here and right now. The way to do that is going through the destruction of the current political structure of the Arab and Muslim world. This is a must. This is a condition. If we want to fulfill this vision, they say, we have to topple down all the current existing political structure. As an outcome of that, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Salafi jihadist movement, and others, they have a list of priorities. Israel is on that list. The United States is on that list. Jews, Christians are on that list, but not on the top part. Their time will come, not now. Now, on top of the list, as ISIS is concerned, or Al-Qaeda is concerned, is to topple down Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. They must go down because there is only one path that leads to this place. This is one important component. And the second important component, in order to be able to qualify or to justify that philosophy, radical Islam gone through an inner radicalization process where basically one of the most distorted concept that came out from this kind of thinking was a concept known by the name of Arabic takfir, which means labeling Muslims as infidels. The takfir ideology is the ground upon which ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others are justifying the fact that overwhelming majority of their victims are Muslims. According to that ideology, in order to achieve the final goal of creating the caliphate, it's not enough to topple down the corrupted Arab and Muslim regimes. You have to purify Islam from within because there are elements in Islam that are contaminating Islam. In other words, according to ISIS, there are Muslims who are fake Muslims and they are contaminating Islam from within. And if you don't purify these elements, you can't move to the next phase. That explains the fact to what we see today, the atrocities that are being conducted by these radical groups in the last generation. Today in 2015, when you look in the context of the struggle over identity, path, and direction between the three different camps that I mentioned, political Islam, civil society / modern state camp, and radical Islam, here is an interesting picture. Political Islam is currently experiencing a deep crisis. Muslim Brotherhood are experiencing a deep crisis. Let me remind you, up until recently, for a short period of time, Muslim Brotherhood, as an outcome of the events in the Arab world, came to power in Egypt, in Tunisia. Muslim Brotherhood gained momentum in Kuwait, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Algeria, for a short period of time. Today the picture is different. Muslim Brotherhood lost its power in Egypt, lost its power in Tunisia. His momentum has been blocked. He is defined today by the Saudis and the Egyptians and the United Arab Emirates as a terror organization. And the major problem today of political Islam is ideological one. What is the core of the problem? To make a long story short, remember what I told you in the beginning. The Arab societies are demanding real answers for real problems. Muslim Brotherhood cannot provide today the people with these answers, and that's why people are disappointed with their way. So it leaves us today in 2015 in a struggle between the two other camps. Radical militant Islam on the one hand, civil society, modern state on the other hand. This is a clash to death or life. There are no common grounds. There is no common denominator. There is no way to overbridge the gaps between the camps. This is what we see today. So in the context of the struggle over path, identity, and direction, today in 2015, we see this massive struggle between these three factors, and mostly between radical Islam and civil society affiliated factors. To sum this picture, here is what I have to say. Three major powers are shaping today the Middle East. These are the elements of which the GPS is made of. The Arab society's challenges, the struggle between the Arab world and the Iranian Sunni versus Shiites, and the struggle between the three different camps, political Islam, civil society affiliated, and radical Islam groups in the context of what should be the path, identity, and direction of Arab societies. These are the three major powers. They have a couple of common denominators. First, none of them have anything to do with the state of Israel. Nothing. Yet, the state of Israel has anything to do with that because the state of Israel is located right in the big heart of this massive earthquake. We are not in Switzerland. We are in the Middle East. This is one common denominator. The other common denominator, each and every one of these forces, separately and all combined together, creates an enormous turbulence. It's inevitable because each and every one of these things that I was describing is a conflictual situation. So what you see today on the ground is the manifestation of these conflicts time and time again, and what we see more and more are the turbulence that are crossing the region from side to side, either in the context of the Sunni-Shiite clash, or in the context of the inner instability in some Arab societies because of the inner conflict between the groups, or in the context of the inner instability in Arab societies because of the political challenges that stems from the huge challenges that these societies are facing. This is a very complex picture, and that picture in the context of Israel presents clearly lots of challenges and hazards. But it also presents, in my view, odds, prospects. Because the name of the game today in the Middle East hangs on, if I will be advisor to the next president or the current or the next president of the United States of America, I would say, Mr. President or Mrs. President, here is what I would like to say about the Middle East. If you want to navigate your way in the Middle East, this is the name of the game. This is the GPS. Try to find the forces that are interested in stability. Try to prioritize the stabilities that different factors need. Try to understand what factors has an interest in instability, because that will help to understand the reformation, the restructuring of the Middle East. And today, when Arab societies are struggling to maintain stability in the midst of these huge challenges, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Gulf states, the monarchies, Jordan, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Lebanon. Syria is already done. Iraq, to a large extent, the same. Yemen, the same. And they are struggling to avoid the fate of Yemen or Iraq or Syria. The name of the game, as far as they are concerned, is stability. They need stability because it's a closed loop. If you don't have stability, you can't create the conditions that need for the creation of stability. You can't bring investments. You can't stabilize the situation. You can't bring money in. You don't bring money in, you don't have the ability to deal with the challenges. You don't deal with the challenges, people are getting more and more upset. It's a vicious loop. And that is the point where Israel, in my mind, has also the odds, the opportunities. Because today, these states are looking for potential partners that could support and comply with their most important interest, stability. So basically today, even almost ironically speaking, out of this huge chaos and instability, what we see is an interesting situation, unprecedented in my mind, where actually for the first time ever, Israel is facing not only the hazards. Israel has been facing hazard all the time. It changes. The magnitude changes, the characteristics changes. But Israel is also facing today odds, prospects, some very interesting horizons in my belief. And by the way, we already have an expression of that common denominators that bring Israel and some of the partners in the Middle East back together to the table. Israel is cooperating together with Egypt in order to confront the challenge of ISIS in Sinai Peninsula. Jordan knows that Israel is its important back, sort of speaking, facing the challenges that Jordan is facing. In the south part of Syria, I would dare to say there is an understanding, at least, between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, understanding that it's their own mutual interest to secure at least the south part of Syria, making sure it will not become stage for either ISIS/Al Qaeda operation, neither nor Iranian Revolutionary Guards presence. So, to put it in a nutshell, yes, there are challenges. We should not overlook these challenges. We should not undermine these challenges. But I think also there are prospects. And to conclude my presentation, I would like to say personally that I think that the way to view the Middle East today and in the foreseeable future, as part of this GPS that I was providing you with this evening, I call it a combination of what I call painfully realistic, understanding the magnitude of the challenges and the forces involved, but yet at the same time, cautiously optimistic. At this point, I'm concluding my presentation. Thank you.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you about was the Arab League. Established in 1945, 70 years later, the Arab League has established a joint military task force, and as you mentioned, they're bombing the Houthis in Yemen. So 1 month before they started, the UN Secretary General said to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, "Let me be clear, Yemen is collapsing before our eyes. We cannot stand by and watch." Presently, there are more than 7.5 million people who are suffering in the poorest country in the Middle East. There's no food, there's no water, it's a humanitarian crisis. So in your recent article, Crisis in Yemen, Significant Milestones, you wrote that the operation in Yemen brings back pride and hope for Arabs. With the Arabs sending a clear message to Iran, we are determined to gain back control and to block you. So please explain the significance of the Arab League actions as viewed from the Arab perspective.
You have to understand, for decades, in the eyes of the Arab world, one of its major diseases was the weak leadership. the leadership of the Arabs, perceived by the Arabs themselves always, and rightly so, as corrupted, inefficient, impotent, unable to lead and to offer new horizons and new ways. That sentiment was intensified mostly in the last couple of years in the context of the events that happened in the Middle East, and mostly in the context of the expanding Iranian influence in the region. The recent event that was basically the water line pipe was the announcement, the formal announcement of Iranian citizens, senior officials that basically bragged, saying to the Arab world, we, the Iranian, the Shiites, we are now controlling 4 Arab capitals. The Arab world went bananas with that thing. You have to understand the enormous reaction that was in the Arab world. As far as the Arab world concerned, this was the rock bottom in a long process of deteriorating situation of the Arab world. So once Arab League, under the leadership of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, formed a power, a military power that was proactively operating on the ground, obviously you could understand that that act is perceived by many people in the Arab world as the revival. We are now coming back. It's like a fighter, a boxer, okay, that he's now fighting back. He's now hitting back. He's not only sustaining the blows, he's also hitting back. So this is the importance of that thing. And then there is another important message in that specific act. This is not only a message of the Arab societies to the Iranians and the Shiites. This is a message to the United States of America. Today, the common sentiment in the Arab world is that the United States of America is making a strategic shift in the Middle East policy, turning towards Iran on the expense of the Arab societies. Basically, today, the common notion in the Arab societies is that the current American administration decided to throw the Arab world under the bus. The Arab military action today in Yemen is not only a signal to the Iranians, it's also a signal to the United States of America. And then there is something which, in my mind, is very much interesting in that context. Following that action, I hear more and more people in the Arab world that are saying, like, okay, we have been doing that successfully, relatively speaking, in Yemen. Maybe it's about time that we will duplicate the Arab coalition operation in Yemen to another arena in the Middle East, located a couple of thousands of miles away in a place called Syria. There are more and more voices in the Arab world today that are openly talking about military Arab intervention in this war that goes on in Syria, which, of course, this is a very interesting momentum. We'll have to see how this thing is going to develop. So these are the 3 major elements or interesting aspects of that specific formation of the coalition.
Do you think that the Arab League has the power and the will to win in Yemen and to go into Syria?
We have to understand what's the interest of the Arab League and the Saudis in the context of Yemen. They do not want to eliminate the Houthis. The Houthis are part of the Yemen political and social fabric. What they want to do is to create a situation where the partners are going back to the negotiations table. By the way, it's going to take place. Recently, it was announced that there is going to be a conference where all the parties involved in Yemen are going to sit around the table and to negotiate, and it's going to take place in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. If that is going to take place, this is a big triumph for the Saudis. This is a big triumph for the Arab military coalition. By the way, as far as the Arab world is concerned, as of now, they already won this battle, which is very important in terms of the momentum and the motivation it creates among the Arab societies.
Thank you. If a nuclear deal with Iran is signed on June 30th or later, it will likely send political jolts across the Middle East. Do you think that Israel and Saudi Arabia would form an alliance against Iran in order to try to curb its growing influence?
We can say, obviously, for sure today that it's already a common denominator. One of the things that brings together an Israeli-Saudis understanding is the fear of the Iranian military nuclear project. I don't know to say what will be exactly the formation of such an alliance, but as I said before, and I think this is the important thing to remember, regardless of that specific point, the Saudis themselves, they are saying very clearly, they are saying, we will not sit aside and watch the Iranians have a nuclear military capacity. So once, if the Saudis will come to the conclusion that it's a fait accompli, it will be very reasonable to expect that the Saudis will spend no time in order to develop such capacities, or at least to have some kind of like an alliance with Pakistan, for example, that basically provides them with a nuclear military shelter or an umbrella. One way or another, we are obviously talking about a very totally different reality in the Middle East with all the ramifications that comes along with that. And it's not so far around the corner. I mean, it could be just around the corner.
Does the continuing conflict with the Islamic State give rise to an opportunity for Israel to forge or strengthen alliances with its Arab neighbors?
Yes, definitely. And again, I want to emphasize something. I know that in the States, people are mostly talking about ISIS. ISIS is yet another very radical group. There are different and similar groups operating under the same ideology or different ideology, but in the end of the day, ISIS is only a symbol. By the way, ISIS, in the end of the day, we have to look at ISIS in the right proportions. It's not Napoleon army crossing Europe, 2 million people knocking on the doors of the United States of America. It's a radical groups with a couple of thousands of militants, and ISIS has to be viewed mostly in the context of what's going on in Syria and Iraq, currently. Now, ISIS, I'm saying always that ISIS' biggest threat is tomorrow. What does it mean? It means that if ISIS is not going to be blocked, contained, pushed back, he will become more and more attractive for other military radical elements in the region, and unfortunately there is no lack in candidates. Today, when you look at the map, and you see the situation, for example, in Jordan, where Jordan is obviously very much disturbed with the challenge that ISIS present. By the way, according to the information we have, there are some 1,500, maybe more, Jordanian Salafi jihadist militants that are involved in the war in Syria, fighting mostly within the ranks, not of ISIS, but Al-Qaeda, but the Jordanians are very much concerned about it. So obviously for Jordan, it's a big interest to make sure that ISIS will not pose a threat. The same applies as for Egypt. They can deal with that. They can deal with this challenge. They have the capacities. Obviously, they know that they have a very strong ally right next to them. It's called the State of Israel, because as far as the State of Israel is concerned, obviously we make very clear that we won't allow any creation of ISIS and such bases in a way that will jeopardize Israel's security and Israel's strategic interest. As of today, the evaluation, I would say, of the Israeli intelligence regarding the level of the threat that ISIS and other militant Islam groups in the region, when you look at the different parts of the region, we have presence of these radical groups everywhere. In Lebanon, in Syria, in the Golan Heights, in Jordan, in the Gaza Strip, in Egypt, in all the areas that borders Israel. Nevertheless, we evaluate today that for different reasons, the level of threat that these groups are presenting to Israel currently is low, and it's containable. Obviously, it could change, but this is currently the current evaluation of the threat that ISIS brings. And obviously, as part of confronting that challenge, you could imagine that there is a very strong, tight, tactical, at least intelligence and tactical cooperation going on between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, and I would not be surprised to know that there is another kind of formation of cooperation going along in that context.
And I wanted to follow up on that. What internal characteristics of an Arab country, whether political, geographic, or religious, make it more suitable or likely for it to become an ally of Israel as the situation continues to unfold? What new allies might Israel have?
I think when you look today in different parts of the Middle East, what you see today, obviously you see the common denominator that Israel has with Egypt, with Jordan, with the Gulf states, the monarchies in the states, which of course tries to outlast this tsunami that today rocks the region. When you look, I would say, in the external circles, one of the things that I'm saying about the Middle East, we have to remember, the Middle East is a very strange place. People that are butchering each other today are kissing and hugging tomorrow morning. This is something which is very challenging, mostly in the context of Israel's geostrategic environment. You know, I could even say, with something that may sound totally crazy today, But when you look at the Middle East, sometimes things are shifting so dramatically that alliances are formed and changes so dramatically. You know, today, obviously, unfortunately, we all know that the level of the threat that the current Iranian regime, not the people, but the regime is presenting to the state of Israel. But you know, if that regime will not be there, and there will be another kind of regime that will be totally different from the current one, I would not even exclude the possibility that in the far distance there will be some revival of the good relationship between Israel and the Iranian people. We have to remember that the problem of Israel is not the Iranian people, it's the Iranian regime. By the way, the Arabs themselves are saying our problem is not the Iranian people, it's the Iranian regime. So in this reforming Middle East, alliances could be shifted, could be changed, could be formed. Sometimes it could be even beyond even imagination. Let me give you an example so you understand. In the 80s, Iran and Iraq butchered each other brutally for 8 years. In a brutal war. 1 million people were killed, chemical weapon was used, major cities were bombed with missiles and rockets. Today, Iranian Revolutionary Guards are fighting on Iraqi soil based upon an invitation from the current Iraqi government, which is predominantly Shiite one. The two states, Iran and Iraq, has today mutual defense treaty. They butchered each other in the 80s.
What are the prospects today for the expansion of democratic values in the Middle East?
These two things are connected one to the other. There are people in the Arab world that basically are totally disappointed, and they say the Arab awakening or the Arab Spring is a total failure. These people call it the Arab winter. They are totally disappointed with that. There are people who say, well, we could see the light in the end of the tunnel. I'm one of these people. I want to share with you something. You know, people say that the Arab awakening results the chaos that we see today in the Middle East. I'm saying something different. The Arab awakening is the outcome of a chaos that was in the Arab societies for generations. It was oppressed. It was underground volcano that the Arab awakening is the point of time where the land was cracked, and this volcano is now erupting. The lava was there under the ground. The Arab awakening did not result in the chaos. It is the outcome of the chaos that was in the Arab societies. The way to go there is long, is challenging, is painful, it's dangerous. But when I look today, and I look very closely in Arab societies for many years, I can see how this struggle takes place, and every day that goes by, I can see how people who stand for the more progress, advanced, if you want to call it democratic affiliated values, civil rights, human rights, women's rights, and so they are getting stronger in the midst of all this chaos. It happens. It's just a conflictual process. I want to remind us all, the United States of America and the West was not born as a democracy. They have been going through a terrible, long, bloody process. Think about Europe. Think about democracy. Democracy was not born out of comfortability. It was a long, agonizing process. Something similar happens today in the Arab societies. There is one major difference. Everything is much more compressed on a shorter time scale in comparison to the other historical scale, and mostly because the presence of a factor that was not there in the past, which plays a significant role in changing the Middle East right now as I'm talking to you. The factor that I'm referring to is what I call the social media. The social media is reshaping also the Middle East dramatically, and to a large extent, not negating its negative impact, to a large extent also positively. So I can indicate today different phenomena that stands for this inner process that goes to a positive direction, but it's a conflictual process. It's not a process that could go smoothly, it's inevitable. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is that we should not lose hope. We should be able to see in the midst of this big chaos, we should be able to see the lights in different places because it's there. It's just a long conflictual process, and I personally believe that in the end of the day, it's going in the right direction. I want to believe so, because I'm basically born optimistic, sort of speaking.
Now, when we talk about Saudi Arabia, which is a majority Sunni country, it has a very large Shiite population who have no rights. Their mosques were destroyed about 100 years ago. There are no leaders in the political party, that religion. They're discriminated against. People can't get jobs. So the question from the audience is, how do we reconcile stability and civil rights, not just in Saudi Arabia, but around the region? Because we can have peace, but what kind of lives then do people have?
I think that's very important to, when we are talking about these values, civil society, civil rights, stability, we have to understand that sometimes in the Arab world, some things are not, has to compromise the other, some things are coming on the expense of the other. The best example I can give you, you gave Saudi Arabia as an example, it's a less good example. The best one I can give you is Egypt. Egypt is a 90 million people nation, 90 million. Every 15 seconds, a child is born in Egypt. The challenges of Egypt are enormous for every government, any kind of government. So any kind of government that rules Egypt, its first priority is stability. Stability in such conditions, time and time again, will come across or will be in conflictual situation with values like civil society, like civil rights, for example, and other stuff like that. It's inanimate, it's inevitable, it's part of the reality that goes on in these societies. Now, there are two ways to look at it. One is the way that is kind of like judging that, which I think sometimes it's the Western approach, coming from this judgmental approach. But there is another way to look at it. This is the way that the Arabs themselves are looking at it. They accept, they understand that in the midst of this process, the strive to get stability, they will have to compromise other values. They understand it. It's not to say that they are giving it up. They are just understanding that in their inner values, in their inner priorities, something comes before something else. And they don't give the judgmental approach that people in the West sometimes are doing when they look at the reality in the Middle East. Yes, in Egypt, for example, people are talking about the huge challenge of a housing crisis that they have in Egypt. By the way, they have a huge housing crisis in Saudi Arabia as well. But they all understand that in the same time, it's not a factor that will, should compromise or jeopardize other values, but in the same time, they understand that if the need is to prioritize that, even on the expense of other values, so that should be the case.
So then are civil rights and the notion of democracy a Western concept? How would the Arab world view those concepts?
Look, let me give you an example. Take Lebanon as an example. Lebanon has an elections, a free elections. It has a very complex political system, but it has a free elections. It has government. It doesn't have president because they have been unable to. They have military force. They have press. They have NGOs. They have lots of things that characterizes any kind of like healthy democratic society. But they also have in the same time military militias that are basically controlling the state. So what is it? Is it a democracy? Is it half a democracy? If in the United States of America you will have any other of military force other than the US military force itself, it's not a democracy. Okay? Take Egypt. In Egypt you have a government that basically have been elected, but prior to that, they have been basically overthrowing an elected president that was elected democratically in the elections. Is it a democracy? Is it not a democracy? And so forth and so forth. So when you're taking this term of democracy and you try to implement it in the context of the Middle East, it's a much more complex picture. Because I think this is something that I would like to share with you. Large parts or many parts of the way that the Western knowledge regarding the Middle East is being shaped is suffocated with narratives and mindsets that are Western-wide, which are very legitimate, but sometimes they are not very accurately dialoguing with the reality of the Middle East. I want to share with you a story in that context. You may remember that there was a certain time where the current administration was very much proactively supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a visit of a Muslim Brotherhood delegation to the United States of America in 2012. 4 people, one of them, by the way, a woman. All of them were very eloquent in English, high degrees. Not surprisingly, many of them got their education in the States. And they basically went to the United States in a smiley campaign tour, basically presenting the Muslim Brotherhood to the Western audience. And their visit here was very comfortable. They didn't really come across very tough questions regarding their ideology, which is by no way could be defined as a democratic one. So they went to the States, they had this tour, and they went back to Egypt. When they went back to Egypt, the newspaper of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was entitling their visit to the United States as an ultimate triumph. And the interesting thing was the way they described it, the terminology they used in Arabic. They called it al-Ghuzwa al-Muntasira, the winning or the triumphing raid. Now, the term Ghuzwa is a very interesting term. It means in Arabic raid, military raid. It goes back to the early days of Islam. And here is one interesting component, which most of the people in the West are not aware of. There is another very famous event that was entitled under the same name, Ghuzwa. This is 9/11. 9/11. So you see that the terminology, the mindset, the concepts that are being applied are totally different. And I think this is something that is enormously important in the context of understanding how the knowledge in the West is shaped regarding the Middle East. I think there is some major challenge which I would like to point out in that context, and that is the fact that I would say majority of the Western mediators of knowledge about the Middle East, the Western, not the Arabs. I'm talking about professors, I'm talking about media people, I'm talking about NGO activists and so forth. Many of them do not speak Arabic. The meaning of that is that the information that they provide to the audience in the West, in the best case scenario, is providing a very partial picture of the reality. And then there is another challenge. Large parts of this information is suffocated with narratives and mindset that are Western, but they are not necessarily dialoguing with the reality of the Middle East. And the outcome of that is what you have in the end of the day is an outlook that is far from really reading accurately what's going on in the Middle East. And this is a very challenging situation in the context of the knowledge of the West about what's going on in the Middle East.
Avi, thank you very much for this illuminating talk. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.